We'll never know whether John's map alone would have been enough to convince Henry Whitehead and the parish council, because at almost the same time, Henry Whitehead uncovered the last piece of the Broad Street puzzle. One evening, sifting through the piles of documents that filled his study, his eyes landed on a single line that had until then escaped his notice: death from exhaustion after an attack of diarrhea 4 days previous. It was little Frances Lewis's death certificate. Until now, Frances's death hadn't been considered part of the cholera outbreak, but Henry realized that she might have been one of its many victims. He was surprised that a young baby had withstood the illness for 4 days when adults often died of the disease in a matter of hours. 4 days. That meant Frances had taken ill before any other cases were reported. He looked again at the death certificate to be sure, and he noticed the address, 40 Broad Street, right next to the door to the Broad Street pump. Henry's hand holding the death certificate began trembling. His brain whirled, at last making the connections that had eluded him and John Snow. Here was evidence of a case of cholera that had started 2 days before the general outbreak in the neighborhood, and it was very likely that the victim's diarrhea had been disposed of near the Broad Street pump, which was the connection between all the other cases in the epidemic. Had Frances's cholera-laden diarrhea contaminated the water of the Broad Street pump and led to an outbreak? Henry got up. Despite the late hour, he knew John Snow would want to hear about his discovery. The next day, Sarah Lewis answered a knock to find 2 serious-looking gentlemen on her doorstep. They'd come, they explained, to ask about her baby's illness. When had Frances gotten sick? Where did the family get their water? Where did their waste go? Sarah showed them the cesspool opening at the foot of the stairs, where several times a day she had poured out the water she had used for soaking the dirty sheets and diapers. Seeing that the cesspool was just steps away from the Broad Street pump, John and Henry knew they had found the source of the epidemic. Tools of the Trade, page 48, the shoe leather method. John Snow is now known as the father of epidemiology. Not only did he create the first map of an outbreak, he was the first scientist to systematically study the spread of disease, looking for patterns and possible solutions. Previously, doctors only gathered anecdotal information from the patients they treated, and they didn't compare that information with data collected from healthy people in the area to look for similarities and differences. John Snow's method of going door to door in the area of the epidemic is now called shoe leather epidemiology, and it's still one of the most valuable ways epidemiologists have of collecting information. The dirty truth. John and Henry made such a convincing case that the parish council ordered the cesspool in front of 40 Broad Street and the well under the corner pump to be dug up. The engineers called in for the job found that the brick lining of the cesspool had decayed, and the earth between the cesspool and the well was soaked with sewage. Anything going into the cesspool would find its way, and fast, into the water well. The cholera from Frances Lewis's diarrhea had traveled into the street's drinking water, setting off the cholera epidemic. A few years after John Snow's investigation, the City of London installed the modern world's first major sewer system, led by engineer Joseph Bazalgette. The city built 132 kilometers, 82 miles of brick-lined sewers to sweep London's waste far down the Thames. It was one of the biggest civil engineering projects ever undertaken, and it made London the most modern city of the time. Cities throughout Europe and North America were soon following London's lead by building sewer systems to safeguard the health of their inhabitants. Cholera. Everything old is new again. Think cholera outbreaks are ancient history? Think again. Between 1816 and 1923, cholera killed over 2 million people worldwide. The disease came in waves of pandemics with just a few years of calm in between. Then, for over 40 years in the middle of the 20th century, cholera seemed to vanish. There's a fairly simple explanation: modern sanitation. As modern sewer systems and water treatment became the norm across the developed world, cholera had far few opportunities to spread. From being the scourge of cities, it went to being an almost unknown disease in North America, Europe, and Australia. But for more than 2 billion people in the world who still lack access to clean water, the threat of cholera never went away. Cholera gets a foothold when natural disasters strike or when war or instability pushes large numbers of people into crammed refugee camps. Wherever there are crowded living conditions, a lack of clean water and sewage disposal, and too few doctors, drugs, and hospitals, cholera has a chance to thrive. That was the situation in Haiti after a massive earthquake struck the island in 2010, making 1 million people homeless. The United Nations sent forces to the island to help in the aftermath of the quake, including some peacekeepers from Nepal who became sick with cholera. Water and sanitation systems had been damaged in the earthquake and the disease spread quickly. Then in 2016, Hurricane Matthew hit the island, causing more destruction, and the disease surged back. When the epidemic finally ended in 2019, more than 6,000 people had been infected and almost 10,000 had died. Epidemiologists in Haiti continued monitoring and testing, ready to act fast if cholera comes back.